It's a struggle. There was a time when I had no internet for many weeks, so I read one of the only books I had, The Invisible Man, and played Half-Life 2 on my laptop every uninhabited moment of the day, not barring, of course, depressing wall stare sessions in which each participant counts until the other blinks. Can you guess which one blinked? I wrote too, because I was going insane, so I ended up going to the laundromat each day to upload a new scripted video, primarily because of the internet connection they had, which I did not. I hid out there most days past 2 a.m. long after the laundromat closed, but I was safely inside, with the door locked, as the entire system was automated. I could open it from the inside, but only the inside. Effectively, I was in my own fortified fortress. It was even warm in there, with no employees in sight throughout the duration of the laundromat's operating and not operating hours. I was free. Me and my friend Magos did a lot of calls while I was there. I'd fuck around with store equipment and screw with people who were sometimes outside the window. It was pitch black, aside from the light illuminating from the street due to the big window acting as the overhead above the couch, which I had discreetly placed myself in between itself and the wall so the security camera couldn't potentially spot me. It was pitch black aside from the light illuminating from the street outside of the big window, acting as the overhead above the couch, which I discreetly placed myself in between that couch and the wall so the security camera couldn't potentially spot me. If the security camera was even on, for as long as I was there, I doubt it. My friends Mark and Sherry once made me read all of Epicurus's parables that he had inscribed as like fundamental rules of Epicureanism or whatever out loud to them while I was staying in that laundromat after dark. We were all laughing at my continual suffering because of the old language in this clearly mistranslated and somewhat rewritten script that had been barely cobbled together from thousands of years of wear and tear. I frequently met this woman who had been no younger than 55, but no older than 70, with a light spruce of worker's boots going so quickly with her disposition. It was out of the ordinary for sure. Why was this woman wearing worker's boots when every other article of clothing had appeared to be modest, fair, and whatever other spin on the term ladylike I can find in my thesaurus? As odd as I found this detail, she was one of the few people who I had even a moment's conversation with, and we kept bumping into one another from there. The few words we exchanged at the laundromat came back tenfold at the library a few days later. We talked about her father and French Canada, I expressed my interest in learning the language, and all throughout our conversation I had no longer been fixated on the clear inconsistencies in her attire, but on why exactly was this lady waltzing around town with no particular goal in mind. Even at the library she didn't appear to read, but opted to sit. At the laundromat, it was the same case. My own mother ran into her and got a ride. I was offered one in that conversation at the library, but declined. She spoke slowly, with a soft cadence. She did not appear to have much to say, or rather, did not place much value on what she did have to say. Every utterance she spoke was not stilted but consciously evoked, practiced with an endemic care. Indeed, not only was the region she came from far off, isolated, specific, and odd, New Brunswick bordering us was not so different in its misanthropic character to Maine, but that was the odd thing about our discussion. I had never once been approached by a Mainer. In the South, it will take you only a few days of being out in public to be approached, but this woman with her gentle, but on the surface stoic, pulled back presentation chose to speak to us, of all people, when every word counted and meant something as to not take up too much time. She was my friend. I was often suspicious of the cars who drove outside late at night. After all, who the hell would be out past 12 a.m. in Caribou, Maine, with majority demographics including the numbers geriatric or dead with incredible frequency? One time I got paranoid enough to dash outside at the sound of one of these ne'er-dwellers, and it turned out they were actually there. By golly, at 2 a.m. I had dashed faster to the oncoming courtyard by the bank, which I had illegally trespassed to get to every day on my way to the laundromat, than ever. I fell down in a puddle, but at that point, the two men discussing whatever nefarious activity they were up to, as nefarious as what would appear to be 60-year-old men can get up to anyway, were outside of my purview, and I was outside of theirs. No doubt they saw me at least for an instant as I sped up the moment our eyes made minimal contact in the dark. There was nothing usual about a poorly dressed twink with unkempt hair rivaling even the most eccentric members of our local homeless shelter. Nor was there anything usual about two older men meeting in a completely empty parking lot at 2 a.m. But there we all were. By the time I scurried back home, I ended up getting lost and barked at by a dog on the way. I couldn't take a shower because we had no oil to heat our home. This was October in the most northeastern state, in the third most northeastern town, with the Canadian border being an hour and a half away, mind you. So I relished in my poor smell and used the few towels we had to dry off, laid down on the hardwood floor, and made use of the clothes I previously stole from the laundromat as blankets. Now starved of nearly any content to cast me to sleep, I was left with the beating drum of my own thoughts to cast me to sleep. The very thing I had, up to that point, been seeking to ignore under the refuge of the laundromat's internet service. Despite miles of walking that month, as my thoughts intruded, I was awake that night, and each night succeeding it. Fun times. Going to the mental hospital for the second time was interesting. I walked several blocks from the laundromat in the freezing cold, what seemed to be under 15 degrees in articles of clothing that were falling at the seams, at some passage of time after 12 a.m. Upon asking a few, the very few, of the remaining shop owners, by shop owners I mean gas station clerks, and by asking I mean going towards the buildings and being too scared to ask for directions, I eventually hobbled my way past a police department towards smoke and steam in the distance, accompanying a lone cab driver. Filling up his gas on the late-night shift at the dimly lit station, I approached the older gentleman. Every cab driver in Maine was an older gentleman, Gen X at the earliest, but more than likely a boomer, if not silent Gen, to ask him where the nearest emergency room was located. He gave me some vague directions that I immediately forgot upon realizing I had not yet traveled that far. I said something like, "Okay, I'll try to remember that," to which he replied, "I can give you a ride." I entered the car and silently rode to the hospital. I couldn't thank him enough. My admission was not a lengthy process. Upon the first door I found, I was greeted with a woman asking me a simple question. "Why are you here today, sir?" "I want to kill myself." "Oh." I was escorted into the room behind the counter to sign a number of papers and be given an armband. Because I was 16, I had to call my mother, who was then driven by the local police department at the request of the hospital. Free transportation is a wonderful thing. I had barely eaten in the days prior, so I was quick to gobble through each and every egg salad sandwich I was presented with. If I was lucky enough to get my hands on a tuna sandwich or two, I was ready to question whether or not I had even had the depression I was seeking to be treated for in the first place. By the time I actually did the intake with the elderly black woman, one of the 3 black people I spotted across the state that I had traveled the near entirety of, I chose one of the 3 hospitals that accepted children for mental health reasons. Hauled off in an ambulance to Northern Maine Medical Center, the short conversations with the nurse riding alongside me made me want to hop across the border away from any future social interaction the moment I got there. Even though one of the conversations happened to be about the Sega Genesis, my misanthropy outweighed my excitement for my passions. I'm a real asshole. There was one other guy there. He had a funny Russian accent, he was American, it was a farce, and somehow got 5150'd for cutting of all things, an offense so minor they would laugh at you at the thought of being institutionalized for such a thing in the previous mental health clinics I had been throughout the United States. I didn't do much there. I colored some and did my best to avoid social interaction. My room was boring. When I got off suicide watch, they finally let me have a pencil and paper. If only they knew, I had already found multiple ways of self-harming in that room. If anything, the lack of paper was making it an inevitability, but I digress. To be honest with you, the most interesting thing to come out of that endeavor was discovering how bad I was at Wii Sports. Did I mention these rich people had a goddamn Wii set up in a mental hospital, and having one of the nurses tell me I looked like Kurt Cobain and had the same height as Kurt Cobain. The latter statement is true, the former is most definitely not. At least I had food. On the way to what was our current home in Caribou, our time in the Presque Isle Women's Domestic Violence Shelter, that's a mouthful, was marred by near constant paranoia. The women had random outbursts of, at one point, throwing things at me, having assumed I had not flushed the toilet. I did flush. Among other things, including random accusations of theft in the kitchen, which led them to justify stealing our food, which was far more coveted in our hands that desperately needed it. Let's just say, those women deserved what they got. In the bus station in Waterville, Maine, where this journey had all started, we were about to get on the bus to Bangor, and then Presque Isle, where I would find those services, and then Caribou to our new house. With only a few hours remaining after having purchased our tickets, I had to talk my mom out of a suicide. She was nearing her way into the street, and I coached her out of it. Probably the most narratively interesting thing to happen in that entire arc to you. I don't particularly care, and didn't particularly care at that time either. Laundromats are cool.